Professor Adrian Lockewell here, and history begins with one of its most elegant contradictions. In the long shadow of Jerusalem, after the First Crusade had shattered the old political order of the Levant, a small house of mercy was founded for pilgrims. It was not born as a fortress. It was not born as a kingdom. It was not born as a banner of conquest. It was born as a refuge, a place where the exhausted could be fed, the sick could be treated, the frightened could be sheltered, and the journey to the holy sites could continue with a better chance of survival. A hospital, in other words, stood at the center of a world that had already decided mercy would not be enough. From that fragile beginning emerged the Knights Hospitaller, the Order of St. John. And that name alone contains the first great mystery of the medieval world. How does an institution built to care for the vulnerable become one of the most disciplined military orders in Europe? How does a house of healing become a machine of war without losing its moral authority? That transformation was not a decorative detail. It was the essence of the order's greatness. Institutions are rarely destroyed by violence alone. More often, they are destroyed by their inability to adapt to the violence around them. The Hospitallers survived because they understood a brutal truth that many lesser bodies never learned. Charity without protection is often only a temporary kindness waiting to be broken. In a frontier world, compassion had to learn the grammar of force. Under leaders such as Raymond Dupuy in the early 12th century AD, the order hardened into a new shape. Rules were sharpened. Hierarchy became more exact. Discipline became a virtue in itself. Service to the sick did not disappear, but it was fused with a warrior's vocation. The same brotherhood that once received pilgrims began to think in terms of guard duty, security, logistics, and survival. This was not a corruption of the mission. It was an answer to history's pressure. The order did not abandon its identity. It expanded it until mercy and combat could coexist inside the same institution. And that is why the Hospitallers remain so fascinating. They reveal something unsettling about human organizations. Ideals are not always fragile. Under enough pressure, they can become more durable, more pragmatic, and more dangerous than their founders ever intended. A moral purpose can be transformed into a strategic one without being emptied of legitimacy. In fact, legitimacy is often what makes transformation possible. The order's care for pilgrims gave it sacred authority. Sacred authority gave it political space. Political space gave it soldiers, land, and eventually a fleet. What began as service became structure. What became structure became power. This is where the story starts to separate from the easier legend of the Knights Templar. Both orders were born from the crusading age. Both were tied to the defense of Christian interests in the East. Both wore the language of faith, discipline, and sacrifice. But their destinies diverged sharply. The Templars became tightly exposed to royal suspicion, financial politics, and the danger of accumulating too much visible wealth in the wrong age. Their fall would be violent, public, and final. The Hospitallers, by contrast, proved more adaptable. They dispersed power. They survived institutional shocks. They moved with the geography of crisis instead of pretending crisis could be wished away. The Templars became a symbol. The Hospitallers became a system. Systems are harder to kill than legends. That difference matters because it exposes a deeper law of history. Orders, empires, churches, and states do not live by ideals alone. They live by their ability to translate ideals into procedure, and procedure into endurance. The Hospitallers began by feeding the weak in Jerusalem, but the logic of their environment pushed them toward defense, and defense pushed them toward organization. Organization required resources. Resources required land, donations, allies, and regular communication with Europe. Over time, hospitals demanded walls. Walls demanded guards. Guards demanded command. Command demanded revenue. And so a charitable refuge became an institution capable of acting on the grand chessboard of the Mediterranean. That evolution is the real drama. The order did not simply change jobs, changed scale. It moved from a local work of mercy to a transregional strategy of survival. And once that happened, it could no longer remain only a religious brotherhood in any ordinary sense. It became a political actor, a territorial force, and eventually a maritime power. That is why the Hospitallers would one day matter at Rhodes, and why they would later matter even more at Malta. Their future was not a random string of heroic episodes. It was the consequence of a long institutional metamorphosis. The world that produced them was already violent enough to require such a transformation. Jerusalem after 1099 AD was not a settled sanctuary, but a prize held under permanent stress. Pilgrims still came, but travel was dangerous, supply lines were fragile, and the Latin East depended on a precarious mixture of maritime support, European recruitment, and divine confidence. Every road carried risk. Every harbor carried politics. Every fortress stood between survival and collapse. The Holy Land was not simply sacred terrain. It was contested strategic ground. That is the larger meaning of the Hospitallers' origin. They were not an accidental byproduct of piety. They were a response to systemic insecurity. Their existence tells a wider truth about the medieval world. When religious aspiration collides with unstable geography, institutions evolve to bridge the gap between salvation and survival. The result is never purely spiritual and never purely military. It is something harder to classify and therefore harder to destroy. In that sense, the Hospitallers became a warning and a promise at the same time. They warned that violence can reshape even the noblest institutions. But they also proved that institutions can survive by absorbing pressure instead of shattering beneath it. That combination made them extraordinary. The same brotherhood that began by tending pilgrims would eventually stand as a frontier power in the Mediterranean, fighting not just for a patch of land, but for the right of a small order to matter in the shadow of empires. And that is where the next part of the story begins. To understand why a hospital in Jerusalem could become a fortress of Christendom, the broader world has to be seen clearly. The Crusader states, the fragile maritime lifelines, the rise of Ottoman power, and the strategic collapse that turned islands like Rhodes and Malta into sites of civilizational confrontation. Before the swords, before the sieges, before the thunder of imperial artillery, there was the problem that made all of it necessary: a broken eastern Mediterranean and a civilization trying to hold itself together at the edge of the sea. The contradiction only becomes intelligible when the map is widened. Jerusalem after 1099 AD was not a serene holy city restored to order. It was the center of a victory that immediately produced new insecurity. The First Crusade shattered one political balance, but it did not create peace. It created a frontier, and frontiers are where ideals are forced to negotiate with supply lines, where sanctity collides with ambush, and where the language of salvation is tested by the brutal mathematics of survival. In that world, the care of the sick could not remain a private act of mercy. A hospital in Jerusalem became something far larger than a shelter for wounded bodies. It became a strategic response to a strategic crisis. Pilgrims continued to arrive from Europe carrying vows, alms, fear, and the desperate hope that a journey to the Holy Land might purchase redemption. But the road to Jerusalem ran through unstable territory, fractured lordships, and sea routes exposed to pirates, storms, and the collapse of authority. To travel was to enter a system of risk. To survive was to depend on institutions that could outlast panic. That is the deeper genius of the Hospitallers. The Order of St. John did not emerge simply because medieval Christians admired compassion. It emerged because compassion in a violent age had to become organized. The care of the sick and the protection of pilgrims fused into a single institutional logic. Bread, shelter, medicine, armed escort, and discipline were not separate duties. They were different expressions of one answer to one problem: how to preserve fragile human movement inside a world built on coercion. The medieval mind did not always draw a hard wall between mercy and force. In many cases, force was treated as the grim architecture that made mercy possible. A pilgrim sheltered by the order was not merely receiving food or treatment. That pilgrim was moving through a carefully constructed political space, one designed to defend the weak in a region where weakness invited predation. In that sense, the Hospitallers were never just caretakers. They were guardians of passage, and passage is one of history's most valuable commodities. The Crusader states themselves were astonishingly fragile. Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa were not vast empires with deep demographic reserves. They were exposed outposts of Latin power laid over a region with older populations, older networks, and far greater local depth. Their survival depended on an unsteady chain of maritime supply, papal backing, noble enthusiasm, and constant recruitment from Europe. Every year required new ships, new men, new money, and new legitimacy. Without that flow, the Latin East would not slowly decline. It would evaporate. That is why the Mediterranean was never just a body of water. It was a strategic system, a living arena in which trade, faith, piracy, diplomacy, and prestige became indistinguishable from one another. Every harbor could be a market, a listening post, a naval station, or a trap. Every island could serve as refuge or as weapon. Merchants sought safe passage, popes sought leverage, princes sought glory, and captains sought profit. Beneath all of it sat the oldest law of maritime power. Whoever controls the sea lanes controls the tempo of history, because distance becomes either a barrier or a weapon. That truth gave the Hospitallers their long relevance. Their future was never written only in prayer books or infirmaries. It was written in the hard geography of routes, ports, and choke points. As the Latin East struggled to endure, the order became a bridge between worlds. It drew donations from Europe, manpower from noble families, and legitimacy from the church. It survived because it became legible to multiple audiences at once. To the devout, it was charity. To rulers, it was utility. To the wider Christian project, it was continuity embodied in an institution. And continuity mattered because the surrounding world was moving in a more dangerous direction. After 1299 AD, the Ottoman state began its rise from frontier power to imperial machine. That rise was not sudden. It was patient, methodical, and frighteningly coherent. The Ottomans absorbed rivals, formalized command, and converted religious legitimacy into military expansion. They inherited a fractured region and turned fragmentation into opportunity. Christian princes quarreled, Muslim dynasties divided, and the Ottomans moved through the gaps with administrative discipline and strategic patience. Their strength was not merely in battle. It was in the ability to make expansion look inevitable. Then came 1453 AD, and the fall of Constantinople changed the entire Mediterranean order. That city was not only the last great monument of Byzantine imperial memory. It was a hinge between civilizations, a symbol of old continuity, and a psychological barrier against Ottoman dominance. When it fell, the Ottomans ceased to be one power among many and became the central imperial fact of the Eastern Mediterranean. The sea no longer felt like a zone of balance. It increasingly felt like an arena being organized by a single expanding state with the resources to challenge fortresses, fleets, and inherited assumptions alike. This new Ottoman power threatened more than borders. It threatened the logic of Christian maritime resistance itself. If the Ottomans could dominate the Aegean, pressure the islands, and sever the supply lines that sustained isolated strongholds, then the older Latin strategy of holding scattered bases would become ruinously expensive. The issue was never simply land. It was whether small fortified communities could survive in an age when empire was learning to think in terms of fleets, artillery, and coordinated logistics. That is why Rhodes and later Malta became far more than islands. On a map, they were small. In strategy, they were enormous. Rhodes stood near the arteries of Eastern Mediterranean traffic, close enough to watch, raid, and disrupt. It was a forward bastion, a warning post, and a gate. Malta, deeper in the Central Sea, offered something even more important. A compact fortress from which Christian power could strike shipping, gather intelligence, and deny the Ottomans uncontested movement across the basin. These places mattered not because of their size, but because of the burden they imposed. Any empire that wanted to pass them had to spend blood, time, money, and attention. That is the true arithmetic of frontier warfare. A small node, if disciplined and well defended, can compel a giant to bleed patience and prestige. The Hospitallers mattered because they understood this with rare clarity. They were not merely monks with swords, nor were they simply knights wearing religious language as decoration. They were a living institution positioned at the intersection of faith, logistics, and military necessity. Their endurance revealed a profound medieval reality. When the world becomes dangerous enough, even mercy must learn the discipline of fortification. The order's importance, then, was never confined to the care of pilgrims or the walls of a single city. It lay in the fact that it transformed vulnerability into structure. It gave form to insecurity. It made a permanent institution out of a permanent crisis. That is why the coming centuries would test not only their courage, but the entire idea that a small, disciplined brotherhood could resist a rising empire by converting devotion into administration and administration into power. To understand how that was done, how alms became organization, how prayer became payroll, how discipline became fleet building and fortress keeping, the machinery of the order must be examined next. That machinery is where the miracle stops looking accidental and starts looking like strategy. But geography alone never wins wars. A fortress on a rock is only stone until an institution learns how to feed it, pay it, govern it, and make it feared. That was the real genius of the Hospitallers. They did not merely occupy places. They built a machine for turning devotion into power. Across Europe, the order was divided into priories and commanderies, a lattice of landed estates, donations, rents, and privileges that pulled resources from the continental interior toward the Mediterranean frontier. A manor in France, a village in Aragon, a revenue stream in England, a bequest from some penitent noble family. All of it could be transformed into grain, timber, sailcloth, iron, horses, and trained men. Medieval war was never only a clash of swords. It was a contest of harvests, shipping lanes, tax receipts, and administrative discipline. The Hospitallers understood this earlier than many princes did. They knew that a garrison starves before it surrenders, and that the first battlefield is often a ledger. That system was not a loose charitable network. It was hierarchical, formal, and international. Priors managed regions. Commanderies collected income. Accounts had to balance. Warehouses had to fill. Ships had to sail on time. The order's internal divisions, the longs, grouped brethren by language and origin into practical political blocks. French, Italian, Provençal, German, Spanish, and other identities did not vanish inside the order. They were disciplined into usefulness. That mattered enormously. A multinational institution can fracture into jealous cliques, or it can become a mechanism for survival. The Hospitallers chose the second path. In a continent obsessed with lineage and local loyalty, the order practiced something closer to bureaucratic centralization in service of a transregional mission. That choice gave the Hospitallers an advantage that was easy to miss from the outside. They were not merely warriors wearing religious vows. They were administrators who understood that power travels through paperwork before it travels through steel. Every estate in Europe became a tributary of the frontier. Every local preceptory became a node in a larger strategic design. This is why the order endured when so many noble enterprises disappeared into history. It was not built around a single castle, a single prince, or a single battlefield. It was built around a system. Yet this was never a purely financial engine. From the beginning, the order carried a contradiction at its heart, and that contradiction became its advantage. It served the sick and sheltered the traveler, but it also trained men for disciplined violence. A hospital required order, hierarchy, cleanliness, record-keeping, and obedience. So did a fortress. A guest house needed provisioning. So did a siege wall. A caregiver needed patience, vigilance, and the ability to endure suffering without panic. So did a soldier behind battlements. The Hospitallers fused these worlds into one institutional temperament. They learned that mercy and force were not opposites in medieval politics. Often, they were successive tools of the same survival instinct. That combination made them unusually hard to destroy. A purely martial order could become reckless. A purely charitable order could become irrelevant. The Hospitallers lived in the tension between those two poles and converted it into durability. Their hospital work gave them legitimacy. Their military work gave them leverage. Their discipline gave them internal coherence. Their reputation for care made them easier to finance, recruit, and defend. Their reputation for war made them impossible to ignore. In a brutal age, the same banner could move from a sickbed to a battlement without breaking its meaning. This is where Rhodes changed everything. When the order settled there in 1310 AD, the island did not simply become a refuge. It became a state. Rhodes was a command node in the eastern Mediterranean, a place where fortification, shipping, and intelligence could be aligned into a single strategy. The walls were only the visible layer. Beneath them lay naval logistics, watch systems, harbor control, and a culture of permanent readiness. The Hospitallers maintained galleys, escorted shipping, harassed pirates, and pressured Muslim and Ottoman movement across the sea lanes. They were not merely defending a harbor. They were attempting sea denial, a medieval version of controlling the tempo of an entire maritime theater. That transformation elevated the order beyond a religious fraternity. Rhodes made it a sovereign power with a diplomatic mind. It had territory, revenue, armed force, foreign contacts, and the ability to shape events far beyond its size. The island became a forward base against corsairs, a shield for Christian shipping, and a symbol that disciplined institutions could still carve out a place between empires. In the Mediterranean, symbols mattered because symbols changed calculations. A fortress was never just stone. It was a statement about who could move, who could trade, and who had to fear interruption. The Hospitallers understood that survival in the Mediterranean depended on balance as much as bravery. Papal support gave them legitimacy, but legitimacy was not the same as rescue. Venice watched them with the cold eye of a merchant republic, interested in stability, trade, and leverage. Aragon and Spain saw in them both a sacred cause and a strategic asset. France remained a deep reservoir of manpower and prestige, but also a stage for noble rivalry and political suspicion. Even local Christian communities living under Ottoman pressure could become informants, suppliers, or liabilities depending on how the order treated them. In this world, diplomacy was not a ceremony performed after war. It was war by other means. An intelligence network woven through letters, envoys, port agreements, and quiet promises. And intelligence mattered more than rhetoric ever could. The order survived because it listened. It learned shipping patterns, coastal weaknesses, and the habits of enemy fleets. It observed the weather, the currents, the loyalty of port towns, the ambitions of princes. It was a religious order, yes, but one that behaved like a watchful maritime republic. In a sea filled with corsairs and imperial competition, information was a weapon as sharp as any sword. A warning delivered early could save a wall. A delayed message could lose an island. A properly placed envoy could secure a harbor long before the enemy arrived. A failed rumor could collapse months of preparation. Medieval power was never only about courage. It was about perception, timing, and the ability to read the world before the world changed shape. That is why the comparison with the Templars is so revealing. The Templars were formidable, but their strategic identity was different. They were more tightly bound to the land routes of the Crusader East, to financial networks, and to shock cavalry on the battlefield. Their image was one of elite martial force backed by immense wealth. That made them efficient but also vulnerable. Once European monarchs began to see them not as holy guardians but as independent power centers, the Templars became politically exposed. They were too visible, too centralized, too easy to accuse. Their power could be described, measured, and targeted. That is often the beginning of the end for an institution that has outgrown its political protection. When Philip IV of France moved against them in 1312 AD, he used debt, propaganda, and royal authority to destroy an order that had become both rich and politically isolated. The lesson was brutal. In medieval Europe, legitimacy could be annihilated by paperwork, not just by battle. Accusation could do the work of siege engines. Confiscation could do the work of conquest. Public fear could do the work of an army. The Templars fell not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not defend them from a coalition of monarchy, finance, and narrative control. The Hospitallers learned from that catastrophe. They survived because they were less dependent on a single geographic base, less entangled in one royal court, and more dispersed across Europe. Their wealth was spread out. Their authority was layered. Their identity was harder to crush because it was not concentrated in one spectacular target. When one center was threatened, the network could endure. That was not luck. It was strategic design. The order had learned one of the oldest lessons in political history. Centralization can produce strength, but dispersion can produce survival. And survival was not a passive condition. It was a form of strategy. The Hospitallers did not merely wait for history to spare them. They built an institution capable of outlasting setbacks by making every part of itself useful. Charity gave them moral authority. Discipline gave them internal coherence. Landed endowments gave them revenue. Roads gave them a fortress. The sea gave them purpose. By the time the Ottomans emerged as the dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hospitallers were no longer merely a relic of crusading zeal. They had become a small, highly organized frontier state built to irritate empires, disrupt commerce, and force larger powers to spend blood and treasure on a stubborn problem. That is why they mattered so much. Not because they could defeat an empire in open field, but because they could complicate an empire's plans. They could turn a coastline into a trap, an island into a bastion, and a religious calling into a strategic system. They forced great rulers to treat them with respect out of proportion to their size. They proved that institutions do not need to be enormous to be consequential. They only need discipline, legitimacy, and a clear sense of where power really flows. And once the Ottomans understood exactly what the Hospitallers had become, the collision was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when and under what kind of fire. By 1522 AD, the question haunting Rhodes was no longer whether the Hospitallers were brave. Their courage had long ceased to be an open question. Generations of war, piracy, and siege had already answered it. The real question was harsher and more historical. Could a small fortress state, built on discipline, devotion, and maritime intelligence, survive the arrival of an empire that could move armies like a tide and artillery like a sentence of death? Rhodes stood at the edge of Christian power as something more than an island. It was a strategic interruption, a stone lock placed across the routes that connected Anatolia, Syria, the Aegean, and the broader Mediterranean. To Ottoman commanders, it was not merely a hostile outpost. It was a challenge to imperial coherence. As long as Rhodes remained in Hospitaller hands, Ottoman sea power could not claim complete psychological or strategic mastery over the Eastern Mediterranean. The island was a warning to sailors, a refuge for enemies, and a public insult to the sovereignty rising from Constantinople. For the Hospitallers, Rhodes had become the purest expression of their institutional intelligence. They had begun as a charitable order in Jerusalem, caring for pilgrims. Over time, history had hardened them into something far stranger and more formidable. A monastery with cannon, a hospital with battlements, a religious brotherhood that had learned to think like engineers, admirals, and governors. Their strength did not come from theatrical heroics. It came from systems, layers of walls, layered command, layered reserves, controlled gates, prepared kill zones, outworks designed to absorb shock, inner defenses designed to sustain morale, and disciplined garrisons trained to understand that endurance was not passive waiting but active strategy. This was the Hospitaller genius at its highest level. Not the charge, not the duel, not the romantic fantasy of a heroic last hour. Their true power lay in refusal, the deliberate decision to make conquest slow, costly, and humiliating. They understood a law that empires learn only after wasting blood on stone. Time can be weaponized. A fortress does not need to defeat an empire outright. It only needs to force the empire to pay again, then return home with the memory that the world is still not fully obedient. That logic worked for a long time because the world around Rhodes was fragmented. Christian Europe did not operate as a single strategic organism. It existed as a field of rival crowns, commercial interests, papal ambitions, and half-fulfilled crusading memories. A distant threat could be denounced in sermons, but sermons do not launch fleets. Monarchs could express concern, but concern does not lift a siege. Merchants could calculate the costs of intervention, and often those calculations produced hesitation rather than action. Rhodes, in other words, was defended by courage, but courage alone was never enough to overcome distance, rivalry, and the mathematics of apathy. Suleiman the Magnificent understood this world with imperial clarity. He did not come to Rhodes as a raider hoping for a prize. He came as the sovereign of a state that had transformed the eastern Mediterranean into a contested Ottoman sphere. Constantinople had fallen in 1453 AD. The Balkans had been squeezed. The sea lanes mattered more than ever. Naval routes now carried not only trade, but prestige, fear, espionage, and the reputation of dynasties. Rhodes remained a Christian spearpoint too close to the Anatolian coast, too useful to pirates, too dangerous to Ottoman authority, and too symbolic to ignore. To leave it standing was to permit a permanent wound in the imperial map. To take it was to demonstrate that no isolated fortress could resist the machinery of early modern empire. So the siege became something larger than a military operation. It became a verdict on an entire way of organizing power. The Ottomans brought numbers, artillery, engineering talent, and strategic patience. The most oppressive combination war can produce. Their cannons represented a new age in warfare, one in which walls could no longer be trusted simply because they were old or famous. Fortifications now had to survive blast, mining, and sustained bombardment. The Hospitallers, for all their competence, were confronting not merely a stronger army but a different historical tempo. Ottoman commanders could rotate troops. They could sustain pressure. They could absorb setbacks and return with greater force. They had the depth of an empire behind them, and depth is often the real measure of power. Not the first charge, but the ability to keep charging when others begin to tire. And here the asymmetry of the siege came fully into view. The Hospitallers possessed professionalism, local knowledge, and the reputation of warriors who had made endurance into a religious discipline. They knew the island. They knew the approaches. They knew where mining crews would work, where walls were weakest, where sorties could disrupt an assault, and where morale might fray under repeated shock. Their defenders were not improvising from panic. They were operating from memory, procedure, and a grim institutional culture that treated survival as a sacred duty. But professionalism is not the same thing as strategic depth. A fortress can have excellent officers and still be trapped by geography. An order can have extraordinary discipline and still be isolated by politics. Across the water, Europe was divided by dynastic competition, diplomatic caution, and a profound tendency to value abstract solidarity more highly than practical assistance. The papacy could bless the cause. Courts could issue words of admiration. But the material defense of Rhodes required ships, money, timing, and unity. Those commodities arrived slowly, if at all. The tragedy of the period was not that Christians lacked language for unity. It was that they lacked the political machinery to convert language into force. That failure mattered because sieges are never just contests between walls and cannon. They are contests between systems. A besieged fortress depends on a chain of support: grain, powder, repair crews, communication, morale, and the belief that relief may still arrive. When that chain weakens, the defenders are still brave, but bravery begins to exist inside a narrowing corridor of options. Every day becomes a calculation. Every breach becomes a reminder that time is no longer neutral. Time begins to serve the attacker. The Hospitallers, to their credit, understood this with cold precision. Their defense was systematic. Their sorties were controlled, not desperate. Their communication was disciplined. Their command structure held under pressure because the order had spent centuries transforming faith into institution and institution into habit. Men could endure the walls because the walls belonged to a larger purpose. That is one of history's hardest truths. Morale is not a decorative quality. In siege warfare, morale is logistical. It determines whether masonry becomes a shield or a tomb. Yet even the best morale cannot abolish arithmetic. The Ottomans pressed the fortifications, widened breaches, and returned again and again. Their artillery punished exposed points. Their engineers tested weaknesses. Their manpower allowed a patience that isolated defenders could not match. The island's very strengths became liabilities. Rhodes was a fortress because it was surrounded by water, but that same water made it dependent on maritime access and external assistance. As long as the sea remained open, the island could draw life from beyond itself. Once the surrounding power could dominate the waters and sustain pressure longer than the defenders could sustain hope, the fortress began to transform from shield into trap. That is the essential cruelty of island warfare. It looks invincible on a map and vulnerable in reality. An island can be a fortress only so long as it is connected to forces outside itself. When those forces fail, geography reveals its darker face. The sea no longer protects, it isolates. The walls no longer exalt, they imprison. And still, the surrender of Rhodes in 1522 AD was not simply a tale of collapse. It was a tale of institutional survival under catastrophe. The Hospitallers did not disintegrate into chaos. They negotiated. They preserved their cohesion. They refused to let military defeat become spiritual annihilation. That distinction matters because history is full of organizations that perish the moment they lose a capital, a treasury, or a fortress. The Hospitallers were different. They had learned to separate territory from identity. The island could fall and the order could still exist. The walls could be broken and the memory of service could remain intact. The fortress state had been beaten, but the order itself was not yet finished. So the departure from Rhodes became its own kind of historical drama. The Knights left not as a band of shattered fugitives, but as exiles carrying an unsolved strategic problem into the next chapter of their existence. Their island base had been lost. Ottoman artillery and imperial manpower had proven that even the most disciplined fortress could not indefinitely resist a great power with patience, depth, and strategic purpose. Yet defeat had not made the order obsolete. It had made the order more dangerous in a different way. A displaced institution, if it survives its first shock, often becomes harder, leaner, and more obsessed with purpose. The search for a new base was therefore not a retreat into irrelevance. It was the beginning of adaptation under pressure. Rhodes had taught the Hospitallers a lesson that every enduring institution must eventually learn. Survival does not depend on preserving a location at all costs. Survival depends on preserving the capacity to act, to remember, and to rebuild under changed conditions. The Ottomans had won the island, but the story of the order did not end in the smoke of that defeat. It moved on, carrying the memory of Rhodes into a new and more compact stage, where exile itself would become the seed of renewed resistance, and where the next fortress would force the empire to pay an even greater price for the same ambition. Rhodes had fallen, but the Order of St. John did not vanish into the historical dust like so many crusading dreams that burned brightly and died in silence. That survival was not accidental. It revealed one of the deepest laws of institutional history. Victory creates prestige, but defeat can create discipline. Some organizations are built to celebrate success. Others are built to metabolize catastrophe. In 1530 AD, Charles V, ruler of a sprawling Habsburg system stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean, granted Malta to the Hospitallers. The gesture looked almost like charity from a distance, but it was really a strategic transfer of responsibility. The island sat at the center of one of the most dangerous maritime corridors in the world. Sicily lay to one side, North Africa to the other, and beyond that stretched the Ottoman sea power that was increasingly reshaping the entire Mediterranean order. Malta was not a paradise of comfort. It was a hard point in a hard sea, a place where geography itself demanded militarization. That was exactly why it mattered. To the careless observer, Malta seemed smaller and poorer than Rhodes, almost like a downgrade. In strategic terms, however, it was a compressed fortress, and compression can be an advantage. Large territories allow for ambiguity, slack, and diffusion. Small islands force clarity. Every harbor becomes a question of survival. Every wall becomes part of statecraft. Every failure becomes immediately visible. For the Hospitallers, Malta was not merely a replacement home. It was a crucible. The order had once ruled a broader and more prestigious island, but Malta would demand something harsher. Not display, but precision. Not grandeur, but resilience. And so the order adapted in the only way it knew how. It turned vulnerability into structure. Fortifications were strengthened. Harbors were monitored. Intelligence became a daily habit rather than an occasional tool. Signal systems, coastal observation, and disciplined command transformed the island into a sentry post for Christian maritime interests. The Hospitallers did not simply occupy Malta. They re-engineered it into a machine for surviving contact with empire. This was no longer a medieval relic clinging to older ideals. It was a maritime frontier state operating inside a world of constant irregular warfare. The Mediterranean of the 16th century was not divided cleanly into peace and war. It was a layered zone of formal treaties, private violence, piracy, corsairing, reprisals, ransom markets, and naval espionage. Ships were not only vessels of trade or conquest. They were instruments of intelligence and coercion. Malta became a listening post, a raiding base, a prison for captives, a place of ransom, and a symbol of defiance all at once. The same order that had once cared for pilgrims now controlled a fortress society where healing and hard power were fused into a single institutional identity. That fusion was the order's great strength. It was also its great message to history. The Hospitallers showed that charity and discipline were not opposites. In unstable worlds, mercy without structure collapses, and structure without mercy becomes tyranny. The order preserved both, not because the combination was easy, but because the combination made the institution durable. Then came 1565 AD, and the Great Siege of Malta. This was the moment when the island stopped being a strategic node and became a test of civilizations. Suleiman the Magnificent had already altered the balance of the Eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman power had expanded across land and sea with a confidence that made many Christian rulers look divided, cautious, and inwardly afraid. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD had not merely destroyed a city. It had announced the arrival of a new imperial center. By the mid-16th century, Ottoman fleets could project pressure deep into the maritime world, and the existence of Malta so close to their routes was intolerable. From the Ottoman perspective, the island was an irritant that had matured into a threat. It disrupted movement, encouraged Christian raids, and stood as a visible proof that the Sultan's power had limits. That was why the siege became so much more than an assault on stone. It was a campaign against reputation. If Malta fell quickly, then the idea of Hospitaller endurance would be shattered. If the order could not hold even this compact fortress, then every smaller Christian power in the region would absorb the lesson. Resistance was temporary, Ottoman victory was inevitable, and fear itself would become a weapon of empire. But the defenders, led by Grand Master Jean Parasat de Valette, understood exactly what was being decided. They could not win by matching Ottoman numbers. They could not rely on unity in Europe, because Europe was fractured by its own dynastic struggles, confessional conflicts, and political hesitations. Relief might come, but it could not be assumed. The only realistic strategy was endurance. Delay became strategy. Survival became diplomacy. Every day held was a message sent across the sea that Ottoman power, however vast, still had to work for its triumph. And that is what made the siege historically decisive. Empires often prefer to think of force as an argument that ends debate. Malta exposed the weakness in that assumption. Force can overwhelm armies, but it can also exhaust itself against institutions that are organized to absorb pain. The Hospitallers had spent generations learning that a wall is not just masonry. It is an expression of collective will, logistics, and moral certainty. The Ottomans brought artillery, manpower, and strategic patience. The Hospitallers brought cohesion, local knowledge, and the ability to make every assault expensive. The conflict became an epic of attrition. Ottoman batteries worked the fortifications. Assaults were launched. Defenses were repaired. The defenders were not mythic supermen. They were professionals bound by an institutional culture that had trained them to survive the impossible by refusing panic. That is the hidden rhythm of siege warfare. Time favors whoever can endure its pressure. For the attacker, every delay multiplies costs and magnifies uncertainty. For the defender, every hour won becomes proof that a stronger power can bleed. Malta understood this at the deepest level. The island was not just resisting conquest. It was purchasing time for history to notice the limits of Ottoman momentum. When the siege finally failed, the effect went far beyond a single island. Christian Europe responded with relief, celebration, and propaganda, because the victory had symbolic weight far larger than Malta itself. The order had demonstrated that Ottoman expansion was not a law of nature. The Sultan's armies were formidable, but they were not invincible. That psychological reversal mattered enormously in a century when reputation could shape policy almost as much as fleets and gunpowder. Malta did not end Ottoman power, but it punctured the aura surrounding it. And in imperial history, aura is never a minor detail. It is often the first layer of power to fail. Yet even as Malta became legend, The world that had produced the Hospitallers was changing beneath them. The 16th and 17th centuries were building a different kind of political order. Power was becoming more centralized, more bureaucratic, more national, and more expensive. Monarchies no longer depended on the same loose network of semi-independent religious military orders. Standing armies, permanent navies, tax systems, and state administrations began to absorb the functions once carried by institutions like the Hospitallers. The age of crusading sovereignty did not collapse in a single night. It was gradually crowded out by the logic of the modern state. That shift mattered because it changed the value of fortresses like Malta. Once, such islands had been frontiers where delegated authority could shape the contest between faith and empire. Later, they became increasingly difficult to justify in a world where governments wanted direct control, not shared sovereignty. The Hospitallers remained formidable, but the strategic environment around them no longer belonged to medieval categories. Canon mattered more than pedigree. Administration mattered more than vows. Centralized extraction mattered more than chivalric memory. Then came 1798 AD and Napoleon. With the arrival of a revolutionary empire steeped in modern military efficiency, the old temporal sovereignty of the Hospitallers was exposed as a relic of another age. Malta, which had once symbolized endurance against Ottoman power, was taken with brutal speed. The loss was not merely territorial. It was civilizational. It marked the point at which one of Europe's oldest crusading institutions could no longer pretend that medieval exceptions still applied in a world remade by modern war. And yet, even that was not the final verdict. The Order of St. John survived, but in transformed form. Its galleys, bastions, and sovereign island state faded from history, while its humanitarian identity endured. The hospitals remained. Relief remained. Service remained. What had begun in Jerusalem as care for pilgrims and evolved into disciplined military power eventually returned to its oldest moral impulse: to heal, to shelter, and to organize compassion so that it could survive pressure. That is the remarkable continuity at the center of the Order's story. Institutions can lose territory, lose fleets, lose even sovereignty, and still preserve a deeper purpose if they know how to translate identity into new forms. That is why Malta matters beyond the details of one siege. It shows that history is not only made by the loudest empires. It is also shaped by smaller institutions that learn how to endure longer than the powers trying to crush them. The Hospitallers understood that survival is not passive. It is strategic. It requires adaptation without surrendering the core idea that makes an institution worth preserving. And in that sense, their story becomes more than crusading history. It becomes a study in how organizations outlive the worlds that created them, and how human beings keep reinventing old ideals when new ages attempt to bury them. And so the final verdict settles over the story with the cold clarity that only history can deliver. The Ottoman Empire won the maps. It absorbed islands, pressed outward, and proved that artillery, taxation, and organized manpower could overturn even the most stubborn frontier defenses. Rhodes fell. The old confidence that a fortified island could stand forever against an imperial system built for pressure was broken. But history rarely judges institutions by territory alone. It judges them by endurance, adaptation, and the strange ability to turn defeat into a new form of power. By that measure, the Order of St. John was not destroyed. It was refined. That is the central paradox of the Hospitallers. They began as caregivers in Jerusalem, a charitable brotherhood formed around the suffering of pilgrims. Then war transformed them. Then logistics transformed them. Then the Mediterranean transformed them again. At each stage, the institution shed one skin and kept moving. The Templars, by comparison, were often more dazzling in reach, more spectacular in finance, and more tightly woven into the economic machinery of crusading Europe. But brilliance can become exposure. Wealth attracts attention. Independence invites fear. Once royal power turned hostile, the Templars became vulnerable to the oldest weapon in politics: coordination between a crown, a story, and a public accusation. Their downfall was not only military, it was institutional. The Hospitallers learned a harder lesson. They survived because they dispersed power instead of concentrating it. They anchored legitimacy in service instead of spectacle. They built a structure that could absorb damage without collapsing at the first blow. That difference matters. The Templars were formidable, but they were too visible. The Hospitallers were durable because durability was built into their design. And that design reveals something larger than medieval history. Ideals do not survive simply because they are noble. Courage does not survive simply because it is brave. Even holiness does not survive on its own. A living institution must turn belief into logistics, and logistics into sovereignty. It must feed its people, maintain walls, move money, gather intelligence, negotiate with rivals, and preserve discipline across generations. The medieval world loved symbols, but symbols without systems are only ceremonies waiting to collapse. The Hospitallers endured because they became a machine for survival without fully ceasing to be a moral project. That is why their war against the Ottomans mattered so much. They did not defeat an empire in the absolute sense. They forced it to spend blood, time, money, artillery, attention, prestige. Every siege became a calculation. Every island became a question. Every wall became a demand placed on imperial patience. The Ottomans were not made weak by a single fortress, but they were made to pay for it. And that is one of the most persistent truths in history. Small institutions, when disciplined and strategically placed, can compel great empires to bleed strength in public view. Rhodes was never just a rocky outpost. Malta was never just another island. They were measuring devices for imperial will. They asked the same question again and again. How much is this edge of the sea worth to the throne? How much blood, how many ships, how much reputation, how much time can an empire spend to remove a stubborn obstacle from the map? The answer was often terrifyingly expensive. After Rhodes, the order did not vanish into irrelevance. It moved, it adapted, it found Malta, and in that smaller, harsher fortress it became a more compact version of itself. A sea power, an intelligence network, a corsair menace, and a symbolic barricade against Ottoman maritime ambition. That was the genius of the Hospitallers. Loss did not end the institution. Loss forced the institution to evolve. In that sense, the Order's history is not merely a military tale. It is an anatomy of resilience. It shows how organizations survive by losing some things and refusing to lose the one thing that matters most: coherence. The modern world still runs on that same principle, even if it dresses it in different clothes. The institutions that matter are rarely the loudest. They are the ones that continue to function when the world becomes hostile. States, hospitals, universities, relief organizations, intelligence services, religious communities, firms, archives, bureaucracies. Their greatness is rarely glamorous. It lives in procedures, supply chains, records, training, discipline, memory, and the uncelebrated labor of people who keep systems alive after the founding myth has faded. History keeps returning to the same uncomfortable lesson. Civilization is preserved less by charisma than by structure. That is why the Hospitallers remain important far beyond Crusader history. They reveal a civilization that slowly learned a difficult truth. Survival belongs to those who can organize mercy, violence, and administration under one roof. A hospital became a fortress. A charitable order became a sovereign power. A shelter for pilgrims became a strategic obstacle to empire. None of that was a betrayal of the original mission. It was mutation under pressure. And mutation under pressure is one of the oldest laws of human institutions. People do not merely preserve what they inherit. They modify it until it can survive the world that actually exists. The Mediterranean remembered them not only as soldiers and not only as monks, but as proof that a small body of disciplined men could hold back a superpower long enough to become part of civilization's memory. That memory became myth. Myth became legitimacy. Legitimacy became continuity. And continuity, that quiet, stubborn miracle that outlives headlines, kings, and empires, is the real empire the Hospitallers built. That is also the final contrast with the Templars. The Templars burned brightly and then collapsed under political pressure. The Hospitallers adapted, scattered, regrouped, and kept moving. One order became a warning about vulnerability. The other became a lesson in resilience. Together they reveal the same historical principle from opposite sides. Power without political insulation is fragile, and endurance belongs to institutions that can survive their own success. So the true legacy of Rhodes and Malta is not the fantasy that walls can stop time. It is the harder truth that character without structure is fragile, while structure without purpose becomes hollow. The great institutions endure when they can carry sword and mercy, memory and discipline, principle and pragmatism, without tearing themselves apart. That balance is rare. It is also civilization's most reliable defense. The empire of the Ottomans rose with astonishing force, and yet even that force had to spend itself against organized resistance. The Hospitallers were never the biggest power in the Mediterranean, but they became one of the most instructive. They showed that a small institution, if it understands logistics, legitimacy, and location, can influence history far beyond its size. They proved that ideas become durable only when they are housed inside structures capable of surviving pressure. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of this story. Not that empires fall, because they always do, but that history belongs to the organizations that remain useful while the world changes its language. The loudest powers often win the moment. The most adaptable institutions win the century. If this kind of history matters, subscribe to Archives of Humanity for more stories where strategy, faith, power, and survival collide in the long war of civilization. And for the next step in the journey, let the end screen lead into the next video now. One simple question remains. Should the Templars be remembered more as victims of politics or as architects of their own downfall? Comment with a single word: victim or architects,